the chain reaction has already started. The problem is only accelerating as we speak. And it's interesting because after the COVID shock in 2020, inflation really started to accelerate fast. We all know that, we all experienced it, we all have seen it. But the Federal Reserve actually stepped in during that time, and they did what they usually do. They raised interest rates to cool things down, slow down the economy, and slow down economic activity. But here's the problem. Those interest rates didn't just hit mortgages and credit cards, okay? They also hit the federal government's own debt. Do you see what's happening here? And as rates climbed during that time, interest payments on the national debt also exploded. Now, these payments are currently sucking money out of the federal budget. That's happening as we speak. Money that basically could have gone to rebuild infrastructure in the economy, improve schools, support veterans, for example, maybe even help small businesses. Basically, that money could have gone back into the American economy. Okay, it could have been invested back into society and to make the American people, much happier and improve infrastructure in the country. And if the interest rates stay elevated for any length of time, for any reason, what happens is the problem only gets worse for the US government. And eventually that will ripple into the economy. And that's exactly why the US will likely be cutting rates very soon, even though they just decided to pause the other day. But they will cut soon because they have to. So think about it. What if the interest payments keep rising and the government can't pay? Or what happens if America defaults on its debt? Would the US dollar collapse? You're probably wondering. Would the world head in towards a global Great Depression 2.0? Well, I'm going to explain that right now. And this is just one way to look at it. So there's a few outcomes that could happen, very realistically. So first of all, right now, the interest on the national debt is already the second largest line item in the entire US budget. That's a fact. It used to be the third, now it's the second. Soon, if it keeps up at this pace, it's going to take the number one spot, okay? So you might be wondering, could the US actually default on its debt? And, well, technically, and more realistically, the answer is no. And that's because the US government can pretty much just print money that it needs to meet its obligations. But here's the catch. The catch is, by doing that, that's just another form of default. It's like a silent default. You see, if the government keeps inflating away its debt, as it's been doing for a long time, by printing more money, increasing currency units into the system, the value of the dollar continues to fall. And the debt doesn't go away. It just gets paid back later in cheaper money because they keep devaluing the currency to keep the Ponzi going. That's called monetary debasement, and that's happening as we speak. And it's effectively a slow motion default, okay? So let's play that out for a second. Just think of it like this. Let's say this trend continues for another 10 years, 15 years. The debt keeps exploding, interest payments keep growing, and eventually the world realizes that the United States government can't pay and will never pay its debt and pay back the full interest on its debt, okay? So what would happen then in that situation? Well, to answer that, we have to look at something that most people never really talk about, and it's the US bond market, okay? The US bond market is the most important thing here because most people focus on the stock market, mainly the stock market, but the bond market is way bigger than the stock market, and it's the most critical thing. And it's far more important when it comes to global financial stability. It's not the stock market, it's the bond market. And the US bond market is the largest in the entire world, with total outstanding debt already exceeding $46 trillion. And it's the biggest asset class in the world as well. So the US Treasury bond is basically the government writing an IOU to investors and basically promising to pay them back with interest over time. It's considered safe, or it has been for a long time, a safe investment. And it's not the US citizens who just buy these, okay? It's also countries, pension funds, big financial institutions. They all buy US debt and bonds because it's historically been viewed as a safe haven, a safe and stable investment, even though it's actually the most unstable, in my opinion. But it's always been seen as safe and stable for the longest period, and that's slowly starting to wither away. But that safety is built on only one thing. It's built on trust, okay? So trust in the US that's what holds the US up. Honestly, that's pretty much it. If that trust disappears, the entire bond market gets shaky. And that's already starting to happen. We are starting to see the cracks in the bond market. And investors are actually slowly dumping bonds. And if that trend accelerates, well, you see, what's called a bond sell-off spiral could actually take place. It's a bond market collapse. And here's where things get very dangerous. It's if investors lose confidence and no one wants to hold US bonds anymore. Bonds turn into a financial hot potato, and pretty much every investor that holds bonds just wants out because they've lost confidence in the US, okay? When that happens, bond prices collapse, they fall. And yields or interest rates shoot up because when bond prices crashes, rates go up. So they shoot up to compensate for the risk. So when bonds crash, the rates go up. So picture this. Instead of getting 4% on a 10-year bond, investors start demanding 15% or even 25% because they're thinking, I don't even know if I'll get my money back. So for my bond investment, I want a lot more return for the risk that I'm taking, basically. That's how rates would continue to go up, okay? And that kind of spike in yields would actually be catastrophic, and I'll tell you why. It's because it means the cost of borrowing explodes because rates are going up. Do you see the connection here? And not just for the government, but for banks, for businesses, and consumers like you and I. So the big question is, what happens to the United States if that kind of bond market breakdown actually plays out in real life? How would that manifest? Well, let's walk through two potential, very realistic outcomes. One, somewhat positive, and the other outcome, not so much. At the end of the day, both outcomes will have pain before we get to a better place. You have to understand that. So, what actually happens if the US can't afford to pay interest on its debt? Well, it's a complex situation, and honestly, I think there are a lot of different variables to consider and that would play a role. But let's start with more the optimistic scenario. So I have my notes here. Here's how things could actually play out, even if things look bad first. But this is the optimistic side, that optimistic outcome. So the US still looks safe in the eyes of other nations, okay, relatively speaking. So even in a scenario where the US technically defaults or starts missing interest payments, what happens is America could still be viewed as a global economic leader in the eyes of the world. And if the world continues to believe that the US is innovative, has strength and long-term resilience, then maybe investors might prefer US assets over riskier alternatives.